Happy New Year, gamers, and welcome to my 2024 Cube Year in Review. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be going over most of the Magic releases from the year 2024, looking back at my initial impressions of these sets for Cube, the top 10 most Cubeable card lists I made for each of them, going over what I feel I got right, what I feel I got wrong, and some cards that I may have overlooked. I will be going over most of the releases this year, but not all. On my graphic, I actually have one I won't be talking about, and I missed one that I will. We're not doing Ravnica remasters today. In general, I don't look at those all reprint sets. I'm also not going to be looking at Mystery Booster 2. These are not completely irrelevant sets when it comes to Cube. They just fall out of the range of things I would normally talk about. New card frames can matter for some Cube designers. They just don't really matter to my interests, so I can't speak on them with much expertise. So instead, we're going to be talking about Murders at Karlov Manor, Fallout, Outlaws with Thunder Junction, Modern Horizons 3, Assassin's Creed, Bloomburrow, Duskmourn House of Horror, Magic Foundations, and a number of corresponding Commander releases. That leaves a lot to talk about, so let's get to it. First up is Murders at Karlov Manor. This is a set that actually is the reason that I stopped playing Arena Limited Opens. Reading this card file was kind of irritating to me, and the big strike against it I have is that I have a strong distaste for the disguise ability. As such, it's maybe a little bit weird that I had two disguise cards on my top 10 list, with Aurelia's Vindicator at number 10 and Fugitive Codebreaker at number 5. I do still cube with Fugitive Codebreaker, it's just a really nice fit for my Tempo Tubert, but part of that is that you're casting it face up some of the time. Adding additional text to an ability like Morph really is a turnoff for me. Anytime you're playing something face down, it requires some additional knowledge on your opponent's part. I'm also pretty cold on a mechanic like Foretell, and in general, I've cooled off quite a bit on Morph. It's just more and more likely these days that you play against somebody that has no idea why you're playing a card face down. So I don't love that. In general, though, I have warmed a bit on Murders at Karlov Manor. There's quite a lot of individual card designs that I do really like. One thing I will say, though, is that many of the cards I like from the set could have just been printed anywhere. At number 1, I had Novice Inspector, which is just a Thraben Inspector reprint. So a card that's originally from the world of Innistrad, now being slightly reimagined with one change in the creature type to be on Ravnica. This set was also a little bit weird because it happens on Ravnica, but it's not really a Ravnica set, so it lost a lot of the resonance that we typically get when we go to a Ravnica world. And the most impactful cards from this set are just the Surveillance, which are not even on my top 10 list, which has to do with the way that I approach making these lists, where I always want to talk about lands. I don't necessarily give them a spot in the top 10. But with how big of a deal Surveillance are, they really should have just been on the list, and they should have been at number 1. I will be talking about them more throughout this video. Generally, though, I think that I got a lot right here. I do like most of these cards. I cube with many of them. Delny Streetwise Lookout is awesome. Hard to argue with No More Lies. While I don't personally play with War Leader's Call, it's easy to see why a lot of cubes would want this card in their Boros slot. I think the significant miss here is probably Frantic Scapegoat, along with Aurelia's Vindicator. Just a couple cards that have a lot of text that aren't too impactful. So if I was going to look at this again, I would, like I said, put Surveillance at the top of the list. Here we see Undercity Sewers, the blue-black one. Typically, the Surveillance that gets called out the most, but the entire cycle is a huge deal. Proph's Eidetic Memory is a card we see in some of the Magic Online vintage cubes. I haven't been a huge fan of this card in Cube, but I get the appeal. It's certainly a strong effect. I've cast it in Pioneer a lot. It's a very fun card. And I would also shout out Tristani 3 Whispers, which, after a years-long search, did give me a new satisfying Celestia slot in the original recipe Tubert. I enjoy playing with this card quite a bit. There's just a lot of activated abilities going on that can really mess up combat, provided it sticks around for a turn. And you do get a lot of power and toughness. You get what you pay for here, which you can't say about a lot of Celestia cards. Murders at Karlov Manor was printed alongside a couple Commander pre-constructed decks, as well as Ravnica Clue Edition. I did write a top 10 list for these. Murders at Karlov Manor was released alongside a set of pre-constructed decks as well as Ravnica Clue Edition. I did write about these, though I did not generate a typical top 10 list. I'd only wrote an article that shouted out a number of notable cards. Part of that is that the power band on Ravnica Clue Edition was very strange. Many of the cards were very weak. They were clearly printed to be part of this kind of in-box game experience. And then you have Carnage Interpreter and Headliner Scarlet, which just have power levels through the roof. Both of these are vintage cube caliber cards. It's hard to justify them in many lower power level environments than that. I've played a bit with Headliner Scarlet, and the fact that it's just really good to cast, whether it's ending the game that turn, or providing value turn over turn after you play it, there's a lot of rate baked in here, and I have not found it to be the most fun card over time. At the lower end of the power band, there are some pretty appealing cards. There is a cycle of lands that enter tapped. They're named after the rooms from the board game Clue. Here you see Billiard Room. They tap for one of two colors, and you can pay 4 and tap them to investigate. I haven't actually played with these cards at all, but I see how they could be pretty fun to play with. And then there's cards like Unruly Krasis, which are between these kind of two extremes, a lot of the weaker cards in the set and the busted cards in the set, where if you have a Simic deck that cares about creatures with power and toughness, I get why you would play with this card. I just haven't really seen it in an environment where it really works. There's generally less to talk about when it comes to the Karlov Manor Commander decks. There are some appealing designs. I think the standout for me is Merchant of Truth. There are just a ton of great white 4-drops throughout the history of Magic, but something about giving Clues Exalted is this really unique space, and there's a lot of ways you could play with this card. The power level is modest, but the design is very appealing, so I do like that card quite a lot, so I do want to shout it out here. Next up is Fallout, which was a release that consisted of 4 pre-constructed Commander decks. Many of the cards in Fallout were printed at a lower power level and or were specifically printed for Commander, as we have come to expect from these Commander precons. There's a couple awesome cards. I think that the top of my list definitely are the standouts for me. Assaultron Dominator is awesome just as a red aggressive creature, and it gets really nutty when you have an artifact aggro theme going on. And Veronica Distant Scribe is just really fun in terms of making junk tokens, which in my opinion are the coolest mechanic out of this set. Pre-War Formalware is a card that sees some legacy constructed play and also shows up in a number of cubes. That one is quite fun. And realistically, the misses on my list are the space between these stretches of cards. So Vault 21 House Gambit, Vats, and Kellogg Dangerous Mind. Both Vault 21 House Gambit and Kellogg have really underperformed for me. They're just kind of inefficient cards, not that exciting. And Vats is also just at 4 mana. There's a lot of stuff in this space of board sweeper kind of thing. So it's cool, but definitely less appealing than the pre-war Formalware. In general, releases like this don't give you the longest list of broadly cubable cards, so I like a lot of my list, but there are some cards that I would update in that space between the Dominator and the Formalware. There's a few other cards I think I would rather talk about than some of these, and those are Alpha Deathclaw, Rose Cutthroat Raider, and Elder Arthur Maxson. Alpha Deathclaw is in the current run of the Magic Online Vintage Cube. I do think it's one of those cards that is maybe a little strong for not powered cubes and a little weak for powered cubes, but it can make decks, it can be impactful in games. So I don't think charming is the right word, but there's a time and a place for it, and it can be pretty fun to play with. Rose Cutthroat Raider is another card that makes junk tokens, and it has some synergies when you sacrifice junk as well. I do wish that there were a few more ways to make junk tokens. It's a mechanic that I hope they'll revisit in the future, and I do want to just shout out to the most impactful cards that do that did print in this release. And Elder Arthur Maxson is I think a card that I overlooked just for only really working with creature tokens, but a lot of cubes do exist in this space where there's this go wide token deck. There's not as much synergy with just non-token creatures as I like to see when it comes certainly to gold cards, but there's something going on here. You have a sacrifice outlet that can play well with a bunch of creature tokens on a wide battlefield, so there is definitely something appealing happening here with the gameplay. It's just not a card that I've really played with, and again, I don't think the Fallout set is that deep in terms of cube. And while I love junk tokens, this release also introduced rad tokens, which I think are on the opposite side of the fun spectrum for cube for me. I generally dislike mill in the world of 40 card decks, and every card that makes rad tokens just inexplicably does not have reminder text. Here we see the reminder text for a junk token, but I bet a lot of players have no idea what a rad token is, and if you put a card that gives a player rad tokens in your cube, it's pretty unlikely that they will not know what to do without looking it up or asking you, or in my experience when it comes to a card like this, they will pass it and not even try to play with it. And on to the set with my biggest individual card miss of the year. It's Outlaws of Thunder Junction, everybody's favorite cowboy-themed plane. I've actually heard pretty low reviews to this, pretty flimsy narrative in the storytelling here. There's a lot of cool individual cards, some of them on display. I think Forsaken Manor is awesome, Slickshot Show Off is awesome. I like Oko the Ringleader pretty well, and Assimilation Ajax is a pretty unique and cool equipment. But the miss I was alluding to there is going to be Jace Reawakened. I had this card at number 1. I've been tricked by Planeswalkers being more powerful than they read before, and you kinda get what you see here. This is a card that I did immediately add to my Spooky Cube, and it's still there, and I think it's still pretty good there. It's just understandable why this card is not very impactful in environments where you don't have a discard matters theme. The most powerful way to take advantage of Jace Reawakened is, of course, to pair it with Valky to give yourself a free Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, but that's really specific. It's a very high power level. It's not the most fun thing to do. I liked it well enough when that was in the Magic Island Vintage Cube. I get why it's not still there. I get why other players aren't going to be nearly as high on Jace Reawakened as I am. I will also say that Aven Interrupter has not really shown up in Cube in a way where I have found it very powerful, fun, or interesting. I would bounce that one as well. Mostly, it's a hate card for Yawgmoth's Will, and the world does not need more hate cards against Yawgmoth's Will. And as for some cards that I overlooked from the set, Bristly Bill has been awesome. That card has been showing up in the Magic Online Vintage Cube. What put it over for me in high power environments was the printing of Nadu Winged Wisdom in Modern Horizons, and anywhere where you have a green beatdown deck, Bristly Bill's going to be awesome. Caustic Bronco definitely has overperformed my expectations. There's give and take relative to Dark Confidant. I'm too much of a Magic boomer to say that Caustic Bronco is just better than Dark Confidant. You know, getting a trigger on your upkeep every turn no matter what, that's a big deal, but this saddle ability has proven powerful in games over time. Gotta shout out the Bronco and Lava Spur Boots. It's just been a really nice equipment, just nice nuts and bolts colorless card. Equipping for 1 is pretty cheap, and Ward 1 is a quite powerful ability. Giving that +1/+0 as well makes this card generally more appealing than playing with a card like Lightning Greaves, which shows up in some cubes sometimes, but is typically a late pick, is typically not that appealing. And you can't find it with Urza Saga, which is something that puts Lava Spur Boots way over if we're talking about high power cubes. Outlaws of Thunder Junction released alongside a set of commander decks, along with the Big Score, originally intended to be another Aftermath-style small booster pack release. After the negative reception and pushback against the Aftermath set, the Big Score was worked into Outlaws of Thunder Junction booster packs, so a Big Score card would just appear in every pack instead of the original intention. For this reason, I did look at the releases separately, though it would make sense to look at them as the same release. I just find that the Big Score cards have kind of a unique enough aesthetic, and there's just a higher density of appealing and interesting cards to talk about that it made sense to break this up a little bit. So this is a combination of releases that I did write another top 10 Cubeable cards article about, and in general I love my list. If we look at the top, Harvester of Mystery, I think that's just an ace. I think Sandstorm Salvager is just a really nice nuts and bolts creature card I expect to see in a lot of cubes, and Nexus of Becoming has been a really awesome card for higher power environments that have kind of a creature cheat strategy. Collector's Cage, I think, comes in a little bit more powerful than I would like for a card I put this high. Collector's Cage came in a little bit stronger than I would have liked. Every time I have tried this in a lower power environment, it has just been convincingly one of the strongest things going on. So as far as an Anthem that can cast a free spell goes, which is basically what Collector's Cage is, I think this is one of those things that requires a pretty specific environment. Not quite Vintage Cube, but not that far off kind of thing. So I'd bump it a couple points here. On the topic of vintage cubes, Smirking Spelljacker is a card that I don't think is fun anywhere, so I would maybe bump that off the list entirely. Sword of Wealth and Power is the kind of thing that was maybe worth shouting out when Darksteel came out. This kind of sword is really just not that broadly appealing anymore, so that was a miss. Even though I'm looking at the card right now, I couldn't tell you what it does. So we could have done without that. And Poetic Charge, I did another card where it seemed kind of cool upon reading. Haven't played with it anywhere, haven't seen it anywhere, wouldn't expect anybody to know what it does, and it costs enough mana that I just don't think it's that exciting overall anyway. And Transmutation Font is really specific, really inefficient, so that one I'm not expecting to actually show up in too many cubes either. I did put Pest Control at number 10, and in my article I pointed out how it's a card that I really do not like, that I really do not think is fun, and like I said in that article, I do think it still belongs on the list, even though in general I'm pretty dissatisfied to see it in cubes. That said, there are some cards that I would rotate out here. You know, the Charge, the Font, the Spelljacker, the Sword. These are worth reevaluating, and there are a few other cards that are pretty appealing and fun to play with that I did overlook from these releases. Those are going to be Generous Plunderer, Hostile Investigator, Legion Extruder, and Vaultborn Tyrant. All of these cards are just fun and appealing, and I could see them really working in a wider range of environments. Generous Plunderer is mostly an artifact hate card in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, but where I think the card is actually fun is when you are just making treasures, giving your opponent a treasure, and hoping that you can take advantage of yours better than they can take advantage of the one that you gave them. So while I haven't had great experiences playing with and certainly not against the card yet, I do think that there is a way to play it. It's something that is on my shortlist to try in the original recipe Tubert, just as a way to ramp from 2 to 4 while enabling your opponent to do the same. I think the card could be pretty fun in that space. Hostile Investigator is just a rate card. It will involve your black column needing to care about discard or creatures on the battlefield in a mid-range kind of way, which, to be fair, black does typically care about. So this is just a nice card that can show up in a pretty wide range of cubes. I've played against it in Constructed, and it seems just totally reasonable. Legion Extruder is a card that I think I underrated at first. I did understand that 2 mana for 2 damage with some upside is just pretty reasonable. What I underappreciated is just how easy it is to get that extra value. You don't need that much going on in terms of artifact support to really put this card over. Something as innocuous as a treasure token, as a clue token, which are just things that show up in every Magic set these days, can start churning out 3/3s and really give you your mana's worth on this one. So this card has played much better than I have expected it to. Even though I did expect it to show up in Constructed Magic, and it has in Pioneer and Standard, it's definitely more of a cube performer than I thought that it was going to be. And I just flat out underrated Vaultborn Tyrant as a creature worth cheating into play. It's just solid in terms of things to natural order out, sneak attack, that kind of thing. And there's plenty of cubes where you'll just cast this thing for 7 and be pretty happy to do so. So certainly should have been on my list over some of the more forgettable cards that I selected. Modern Horizons 3 was a doozy of a set. It was the release this year that I definitely needed the most cards from, but what I will say about it is that the power level is so high that looking at my list, I don't know how much I actually like Modern Horizons 3 for Cube, at least in terms of broad cubability. I've tried Psychic Frog in a number of environments, and it's just too strong. It's arguably one of the best things going on in Modern, and there's just a lot going on in this set on those lines. Springheart Nantuko has been part of a banned deck. A Johnny Nakatl Pariah, same thing. Also still performing very well in Modern. Philia is just super strong. Tameo is a card I've had to cut from a couple cubes for being too strong. So the power level in this set is just through the roof, and a lot of the cards are really specific. That said, there's not a ton of wiggle room on my list. Even still, if we're talking about cards that just should be in high power level cubes. That said, what's going on in Modern Horizons is mostly just juicing up high power cubes. That said, high power and or really specific stuff is really just what's going on in Modern Horizons 3. I definitely cube with a lot of cards from this set that I think most people don't. I did build an entirely new cube with the new Eldrazi support, the Eldrazi Tubert, that has a ton of Modern Horizons 3 stuff. That's been really fun to play with, but it does not mean that I would shout out any cards in that cube over a card like Psychic Prog, which is just a staple of the high-powered cubes. There's also a lot of really cool energy support that bolsters that as a cube theme. It's just that it's hard to talk about Modern Horizons 3 without talking about all of these really powerful cards that everybody's going to think of when you mention the set. I will say that my number 1 and 2 pick are pretty modest, certainly in the context of this set. Both Marionette Apprentice and Witch Enchanter are strong, but in ways where they're not overpowered, in ways that I think that they play pretty well, that have reasonable play patterns. So I'm very happy having selected those at 1 and 2. The 2 cards that I think I would eject from this list are Birthing Ritual and Warren Soul Trader. They're a little bit too specific while also being really powerful, so it makes sense to me to try to dig into the set to find something to swap them out for. And the 2 cards that I like happen to be the same colors. Nethergoyf has just been awesome. It's a card that I did pick up a couple copies of on release because I had specific cube environments in mind. But it turns out that any cube with fetch lands and any kind of modest Delirium support, which is just not that hard in regular games of Magic, is going to want Nethergoyf. This set also released alongside a commander deck that has some specific Lurgoyf synergies, so that puts it over there too. So Nethergoyf has been awesome. And Malevolent Rumble is a card that I did not pay too much mind to during preview season, but as soon as I had it pointed out to me that the Eldrazi spawn token more or less means that Malevolent Rumble only costs 1 mana on account of that rebate, I've been looking at it very differently. It's been a really awesome card and constructed, and it's sweet in cubes from Pauper to Power. Just a lot of ways to take advantage of this card that fills up the graveyard at a really cheap cost. So I would definitely sub that in over Birthing Ritual. A lot easier to make that work in a lot of cubes. In Modern Horizons 3, Commander is the rare Commander deck release where I did write an entire article just about these Commander decks, and this is the top 10 list that I published, and I do generally stand by this one. I think Pyrogoyf and Bloodbraid Challenger at the top, Barrogoyf as well. There's just really not much argument there. Some of the stuff lower on the list, Aggressive Pyromancy, Omo Queen of Vesuva, Sahorn Nemesis, you're not really going to see in too many places. But these decks don't go that much deeper than this. Outside of my list, there's a few cards I could name. I don't have Copy Land on my list, which I think is pretty cool. It's just a 3-mana enchantment that enters as a copy of a land, but how many cubes really want that? The big ones are definitely the Challenger and the Pyrogoyf. I have them at number 1 and number 2, so I'm happy there. And then we have the small booster release that was actually released as a small booster release, Assassin's Creed. So there's no Commander precons. This is a Universes Beyond set that was just released in small booster packs, even after the Aftermath fiasco. Assassin's Creed is at a pretty low power level, which, given the fact that it was that small booster release, I'm pretty happy about it, because in general, I did not want too many cards from this set. And the card file is fairly shallow. There's some pretty nice historic matter stuff that can bolster a cube that's in that kind of space, and we're getting closer and closer all the time to me exploring the Mox Amber cube. We're just not there yet. I do like a number of these cards. I do think that Tax Collector is the standout in terms of cards that could just show up in most cubes and be reasonable without batting too much of an eye at it. Most of the other stuff happening here is pretty specific. The card I've actually had the most fun playing with out of Assassin's Creed is Mary Reed and Anne Bonny. I love cards that are discard outlets that also have independent discard matters clauses. The fact that this is a 3/3 haste that can attack or loot is awesome, and the fact that no matter what causes you to discard an island, or a pirate, or a vehicle, will give you a treasure token. About half this list is pretty forgettable though. Become Anonymous, The Acer Escape Valhalla, Ezio, Brash Novice. Not a lot going on there. Given another pass at the set, there are a couple different cards that I would like to highlight. And those are Arbaz Mir, Yggdrasil Rebirth Engine, and Head Splitter. Arbaz Mir has just been a fun card in the Artifact Tubert, and again, if we're talking about historic support, it's just an awesome card for that. It's definitely going to show up in that Mox Amber cube when I finally get around to that. Both dealing damage and gaining life on the trigger is awesome. Yggdrasil is just a self-contained creature cheat kind of card, which makes it worth putting in any environment that's trying to put an Emrakul or some other big boom boom on the battlefield. This card sees some modern play, so in that way it's definitely worth talking about. And Head Splitter is just one of those cards that makes 2 cards. So it's worth mentioning, certainly on the list where I was talking about a card like Ezio, which is just a cheap creature with power and toughness that isn't that appealing. Next up is Bloomburrow, everybody's favorite new world full of cute little critters that offers support to previously under or unsupported creature types. Otter fans rejoice, your time has come. I think this is actually the worst top 10 list that I've published this year. Looking over this list, I'm seeing a lot of cards that I don't play with, that I don't know of other people playing with, and a couple of cards that I soured on pretty quickly after trying. I do think Kitsa is awesome, it's just that the looter space is really saturated now, so there's not as much room for that kind of thing as I maybe thought looking this over. So I definitely think I overvalued Kitsa, putting Kitsa as number 1, and then there's just kind of a who's who of forgettable cards from the set after that. Infamous Cruel Claw really didn't land, though I get the campfire appeal. It can be a fun story card. I just haven't really warmed to it in any of my environments or actually seen people playing with it much since the initial hype on the card. Rail Crackling Wit's a bit inefficient. Maha's Feathers Knight, same kind of thing. There's good text on these cards. It's just a question of where is it actually going to see play. Warren War Leader, more of the same. I like Portent of Calamity. I like Mockingbird. I will say Portent of Calamity is pretty specific, so it should be on the bottom half of the list, but Mockingbird is maybe a number 1, 2, 3 card from this set. It's been a lot of fun to play with, and while it does not have the appeal of other clones where you can easily clone some giant thing, it's really fun in environments where the gameplay is more grounded about creatures attacking and blocking. So when the game is largely about creatures that cost 1, 2, 3, 4 mana, Mockingbird is going to be awesome in those kinds of cubes. Sunspine Lynx was fine and I think reasonable to shout out on the list. I do think that I really overrated Darkstar Augur. I found the idea of a Dark Confidant ability with Offspring giving you that question when you cast it about do you want to have 2 of this effect in play? I thought that seemed really fun, but it turns out at 3, you're really paying for what you get, and it's really punishing. It's just really tough to leverage this card in actual games the way that I imagine it playing out in my head. It maybe deserves a top 10 slot, but number 9 or number 10, it just has not been great in my experience. And a card that I cut the first time that somebody asked me what it did is Zoraline Cosmos Caller. I was looking for a replacement for Lurrus of the Dream Den and the Tempo Tubert. I cast this. It's very similar in texture of cards without having the nonsense companion ability. But just reading this text box out loud, it felt like a chore. I was over it. That's a me thing. It's reasonable to have this card in your cubes. I'm just saying I'm pretty sour on it personally. And Bloomburrow is just a deeper set than I gave it credit for on my first review. Emberheart Challenger definitely stood out to me during preview season, but I was thinking more for Constructed. I underrated just how much a card of this shape, 2 mana, 2/2 haste prowess, just fits into a lot of cubes. Awesome just in any aggressive deck. It has enough stats where it's great if you can cast 1 spell and just fine if you can't. So that one has certainly overperformed for me in cube. And speaking of overperformers, most of the talents in this set are just awesome. Stormchaser's talent has been super fun for me in multiple cubes, also a standard all-star. Caretaker's Talent, another card that has seen a good amount of standard and even pioneer play. Just a really cool token support thing that gives you a little bit of card advantage as well as an anthem. And I think that the most fun of these cards, and maybe the card that should have been my number 1 card for cube from the set, is Innkeeper's Talent. Being a cheap card that can size your creatures in an environment where the gameplay is largely about creatures at a really cheap rate is really nice. And then also having this doubling season effect baked in. I know that there are a lot of doubling season fans out there. It's just really hard to put the card doubling season in most cubes and expect to be able to take the turn off and to get that payoff without just being killed by your opponent. So having a card that otherwise does something that opens the door for weird doubling season games is very cool. Any cube that's largely about creatures and planeswalkers, which is pretty regular gameplay, which is the kind of gameplay I generally enjoy, can get a lot of mileage out of Innkeeper's Talent. So it's just a really fun, really awesome card. And Offspring has just been a nice ability. Both Paw Patch Recruit and Iridescent Vinelasher are just cheap creatures with reasonable abilities that can give you a little bit of upside if you're willing to spend a little bit more mana on them. And a card that I would be remiss if I didn't talk about that I deliberately snubbed from my top 10 list is Beza the Bounding Spring. I just don't think that timely reinforcements and that kind of stuff is a fun card to put in cube. It is obvious where this card is strong. If your opponent is trying to aggressively damage your life total, you get a bunch of life, you get a bunch of blockers. Cool, yeah, it's great there. But there's a lot of cards that are great there, and they aren't hate cards. This is just not that strong if your opponent is doing literally anything else. So it's a card that's uniquely punishing, and that's the kind of thing that I just don't think is very fun in cube. This is a strong card that's only contextually strong. It's questionable if it's punishing the right people. If you hate aggro that much, just don't support aggro in your cube. You don't need to punish people for trying. Bloomburrow also came along with a set of commander decks. I haven't previously released anything discussing Bloomburrow Commander. Like many commander releases, it's pretty slim on offerings for the broad world of Cube, but there are a few cards worth highlighting, as is typically the case. Agate Instigator, Bloodroot Apothecary, Hazel's Brewmaster, and Jacked Rabbit are all pretty cool, with the exception of Jacked Rabbit. Pretty specific in applications here. Agate Instigator is for an environment with a go wide strategy that maybe doesn't care about getting the most power and toughness on your cheap red creatures. Bloodroot Apothecary is a toxic card, which we only get so much stuff that doles out poison counters, so it's always worth shouting out new stuff in that space. Hazel's Brewmaster is a weird one. It has an infinite combo with Devoted Druid if you can turn your Devoted Druid into a food token, which is pretty neat because food tokens don't die if you put a bunch of -1/-1 counters on them. They also have haste because they're not creatures, so there's something going on there. They tried this in the Magic Online Vintage Cube. It didn't super work there, but in a reasonably high power cube, maybe with a ton of specific focus on Devoted Druid, or just other food synergies, there's something going on here. There's something to like. And Jacked Rabbit's just a big monster. I don't know, I like that guy. A lot of easy ways to synergize with this card, be it Anthem, Soul Clamp, what have you, and you just get a lot of rate on this one card just in a regular game of Magic as well. So definitely a cube card worth knowing. And that brings us to our last couple releases. These are the sets that I actually previously put out video content for. Duskmourn House of Horror was my most recent video. This top 10 list is fresh enough that I don't really have any reason for reevaluating it. If anything, I've played a little bit more with Sheltered by Ghosts. I added it to my vintage cube after my video, and the first draft I had it in a blue-white deck with a couple Thraven Inspectors and a Tamiyo, and it was just really nice having this 2-mana Oblivion Ring in my low to the ground deck. So like that card a lot, stand by this list, and I've been pretty happy with a lot of what's going on in Duskmourn House of Horror. Duskmourn was also released alongside a set of commander decks, another set that I have not previously released any content regarding. This is something that I think there will be more room to do now that I am doing videos instead of articles published by somebody else. Definitely something that I want to fit into my release schedule this year. For now, I'll say that Ancient Cellar Spawn, Metamorphosis Fanatic, Formless Genesis, Deluge of Doom, Suspended Sentence, and Ursine Monstrosity are all pretty appealing cards from this set. They're at least worth knowing about. Metamorphosis Fanatic is certainly the most noteworthy here, seeing a lot of play in Legacy. It's in the current Magic Online Vintage Cube, as is Ursine Monstrosity, but the Fanatic here is one that's worth paying attention to just because it's really strong in even the highest power Reanimator decks. It's probably a little bit too strong if you're not at the absolute highest power level, and I will say that Miracle is a mechanic that I think it's tough to just add one card with Miracle to an environment. Having to check your draw step every turn, that stuff can be a little bit tedious. I have a bit of distaste for this in my personal cubes, but it's definitely a card worth knowing about if you're into that kind of thing. The card on this list that I personally like the most is Suspended Sentence, a removal spell that kind of keeps coming back, very spooky, very fun, and in particular, I like controlling cards that actually advance the game towards a conclusion. So a kill spell that makes your opponent lose 3 life and keeps coming back. Over time, this card will end the game. So some interesting gameplay there. Maybe your opponent could try to control no creatures when it comes off suspend. Maybe they'll try to close the game before that happens. It is quite strong, but there is some back and forth there, and I've enjoyed playing with the card to this point. And that brings us to the final release of 2024, Magic the Gathering Foundations. This was the first video I put up on YouTube, this top 10 list. I stand by what's happening here. I've had a lot of fun playing with Kellen Planar Trailblazer, and I've been thinking a lot about what kind of cube I want to put Leyline Axe in. I definitely want to make that happen at some point. I've thought about just tossing it in the Artifact Tubert. I think actually casting it in that environment is a little bit heavy on mana, and maybe even getting it for free is not exactly what you want to get up to, but the wheels are turning. That is a card I definitely want to be cubing with. I also want to say that Magic Foundations is maybe my favorite set of the year. I really like this return to simplicity, showing off that cards can be strong without being overly complex, and also that cards can be strong without being backbreakingly strong. Something I said about Seer Slicer Goblin in my top 10 video is how the card does snowball. It is strong, but it's not totally backbreaking. It's not difficult to imagine playing a game against this card for multiple turns and just being fine, just by tendering some blocks. So in terms of power level and complexity, I think Magic Foundations is a home run for me. I understand why you can't do this thing very often. I also appreciate how difficult it is to come up with this many elegant designs that can play this well with the level of complexity we see in the average Magic release. I just want to shout this out as a masterpiece in terms of set releases. I didn't go over a full top 10 when it came to Foundation's Jumpstart, as it's a pretty small release and there was only a few cards that I found specifically worth shouting out in the broad world of Cube, those being Wriggling Grub, Go Forth, and Scythecat Cub, but I did miss a pretty nice one in Ivora Insatiable Air. This is another one of those cards with independent discard abilities and triggers for discarding. Getting a blood token when it enters or deals damage to a player is really cool, and the fact that Ivora grows off of any discard means this creature can get pretty large pretty quickly, and it has trample to boot. It's just a nice 2-drop that is fairly easy to manage on its own, but with a couple discard synergies, you could see it getting really large really quickly, which is a really fun thing for me, a central theme in my Spooky Cube. I'd like to close things out with a couple superlatives, the first being the most impactful release of the year. I'm not talking about sets, I'm naming the Surveil lands, the full cycle of the 10 Surveil lands as my release of the year. Not Murders of Karlov Manor, because again, it feels like these lands could have been anywhere, and wherever they came from, these are massive for the world of Cube. Fetchable lands with types that enter and Surveil, these are just really nice to either fetch up, just to play in your deck, get a little upside. Huge upgrade over temples, which are fine cards that have been outmodded. Just giving the basic land types is nice there, and being able to put the card in the graveyard instead of just scrying it is pretty nice as well. The big thing that these cards do is give us another high power cycle of lands with types. Something that I see in a lot of cubes is designers doubling up on shock lands or fetch lands. Personally, I have a strong preference for fully maintaining Singleton through a cube list, or if you're breaking it, doing it in many ways deliberately, as opposed to just trying to make the mana a little bit better. So these lands existing makes it that much easier to have a great mana base while maintaining full Singleton. This is a cycle of lands I think I have in 3 different cubes. I only see that number going up over time. These are awesome all the way up to Vintage Cube. You can play them in lower power level environments as well. I cannot say enough things about how awesome these cards are for Cube. And that brings us to my card of the year. It was my number 1 card from Modern Horizons 3. It is my number 1 card of 2024. I think Marionette Apprentice is emblematic of everything that WotC got right with Magic releases this year. It came from Modern Horizons 3, but hits the notes closer to Magic Foundations. It's not brutally overpowered. It is better than Blood Artist in some ways, but worse in others. It doesn't trigger off your opponent's stuff. It doesn't gain you life. So it pushes the power envelope while being generally simple and not just being better than things that we've seen before. So in terms of what I like to see, what I hope to see more of, stuff in this space where it's a pretty easy to intuit card. You can argue it's maybe improved over things that we've seen before, but it's easy to understand and it's not obnoxiously powerful. I think Marionette Apprentice is a 10 out of 10 design, and while it is not as impactful as the Surveil lands in terms of Cube broadly, it is just 1 card as opposed to a full cycle, and it is meaningful for me to differentiate those 2 things. And that's a wrap on Cube for 2024. I know that I'm releasing this a couple days into 2025. Videos are hard to make, what can I say? I'm really happy with the set releases we got this year. I've added a lot of new cards in my cubes. I've designed a couple new cubes. 2024 was a great year for Cube Draft, whether we're talking about card designs and set releases as I have today, or if we're talking about Cube events happening. This was the first year I attended CubeCon, which was awesome. I definitely hope to do that again. We also held a 64-player Cube event at Lodestone at Gathering for Good just a couple weeks ago. I would love to do more of that kind of thing. The Cube community is turning out in a great way. Cube design has evolved so much. People are really taking Cube and making this great game their own. I love to see that. I love to connect with other creative people in this space. And this year has been such a good year for that, and I'm really looking forward to 2025 in that regard. You can also expect to see more video content from me. I'm still learning the ropes and all this stuff. I hope that you've enjoyed what you've seen so far. I hope to continue making more and better stuff in this space. I have some ideas. More to come later. And one thing regarding video content in 2025, I don't know if I want to keep with this clickbaity top 10 list thing. I think I want to do more set first impressions as we see releases going forward and focus less on rankings and more just talk about all the cards that I like. I don't want to go overboard like we used to do on the 540 and talk about most of the cards, but I do want to do more than 10 if there's more than 10 worth talking about. And I don't want to stretch my list to 10 if I feel like a set is not that impactful. Specifically, I want to do some videos about Commander pre-con releases as they come out, and as I've said in this video a couple times, those releases tend to be a little bit light, but I would like to talk about a couple 3-5 cards and really highlight everything that I like as it comes out. And this is my channel, I get to do whatever I want. So 2025, I'm going to be grabbing the reins a little bit more. And if you have some ideas, some feedback for what you would like to see in this coming year, definitely hit me up in the comments. Feed that algorithm. Thank you so much for watching. 2024 was an awesome year for Cube. I hope that 2025 is the same. I hope that you all have a great year ahead of you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.